The room was filled with applause before anyone even realized what it was for. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead, throwing soft light across white tablecloths and polished glasses. Nearly 270 People's studio executives, actors, musicians. Critics sat shoulder to shoulder in a grand Hollywood banquet hall. The kind of place where reputations were built or broken with a single sentence. It was meant to be a night of celebration, a charity gala, a room full of legends. Smiles everywhere. But behind those smiles, something sharper lingered a go. At one corner table sat Clint Eastwood, tall, composed, quiet. He wasn't laughing loudly like the others. He rarely did. His presence carried a seriousness that made people straighten their backs when he passed. To many in the room, he represented discipline, grit, and a new kind of Hollywood masculinity, cold-focused, unshakable. Across the room sat Dean Martin. Dean didn't look like he belonged in the same world. Where Clint was rigid, Dean was relaxed. Where Clint was silent, Dean was charming. His laughter came easily. His smile even easier. He shook hands, cracked gentle jokes, and really listened when people spoke to him. Some called him effortless, others called him lucky. A few quietly called him a fraud. Dean had heard those whispers his whole career. He's just a singer. He's not serious. He plays himself. Anyone could do what he does. What they didn't see was the years before the spotlight. The empty rooms. The nights where music was the only thing standing between him and quitting altogether. But tonight wasn't about the past. Tonight was about something far more dangerous. Public pride. As dinner plates were cleared, the host stepped onto the stage and invited a few guests to share memories, funny stories, heartfelt reflections, light remarks. Nothing sharp, nothing cruel. That was the unspoken rule. Clint Eastwood stood up. The room quieted. People leaned forward. This wasn't a man who spoke without reason. Clint walked to the microphone slowly, hands relaxed, eyes scanning the crowd. A few polite laughs followed as he made a dry opening remark. Then he paused, and his gaze landed on Dean Martin. A faint smile touched Clint's face, but it wasn't warm. "You know," Clint said calmly, "Hollywood is full of people who are praised more for personality than talent." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Dean felt it immediately, and it fair awareness. Clint continued. "Some people coast on charm, on being liked. They entertain, sure, but craftsmanship." He shrugged. "That's something else entirely." A few nervous chuckles. People assumed it was abstract. Then Clint turned slightly. "And let's be honest," he said, voice steady. "Some performers are little more than hacks who got lucky." Silence. Not a dramatic silence. A heavy one. Everyone knew. Dean Martin sat still. He didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't look down. Clint added the final blow without raising his voice. We confuse applause with greatness far too often. 270 people sat frozen. Some stared at Dean. Some stared at Clint. Some stared at their plates, wishing they were anywhere else. Dean's closest friend leaned in, whispering urgently, "Don't respond. Let it go." Because everyone expected one thing, a joke, a deflection, a smile to smooth it over. That's what Dean Martin was known for. But Dean didn't stand up right away. Instead, he stayed seated. He took a breath. And in that moment, memories flooded him not of fame, but of failure. Of being told he wasn't enough. Of being dismissed. Of being underestimated by people who had never walked his road. He could feel the old anger rise. But he didn't let it drive. After several long seconds, Dean stood. No applause followed. No encouragement. Just tension. He walked to the microphone, not hurried, not slow measured. Calm, the way a man walks when he has nothing to prove but something important to say. He adjusted the mic slightly. Then he looked at Clint. and smiled. Not a mocking smile, a gentle one. People leaned in. Dean continued. And sometimes it also confuses silence with substance. The room went completely still. Dean didn't raise his voice. Didn't insult, didn't accuse. He simply spoke. "I've never claimed to be the greatest actor," he said, "or the deepest thinker in this room." He paused. "But I've worked. I've failed. I've listened, and I've learned something important along the way." He looked around the room, now not just at Clint. "Talent gets attention," Dean said, "but character earns respect." A few heads nodded. Dean turned back to Clint. "You may think I'm a hack," he said evenly. "That's your right." Then he smiled again, warmer this time. "But I sleep well knowing I never had to step on someone else to stand tall." You could hear someone inhale sharply. Dean stepped back from the mic. He didn't wait for applause. He walked back to his seat. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly people began clapping. Not the loud, wild applause of entertainment, but something deeper. Respect. Clint Eastwood remained standing at the stage. His jaw tightened slightly. For the first time that night, he looked uncertain. Because Dean Martin hadn't fought him. He hadn't insulted him. He had done something far more powerful. He had exposed the difference between confidence and ego. And everyone in that room felt it. But the night wasn't over. Not even close. Because what Clint would do next, away from the microphones, away from the crowd, would change how both men were remembered forever. The applause didn't explode. It settled. That was the strange part. Instead of cheers and whistles, the room filled. They were acknowledging a truth. Dean Martin sat down slowly, his hands folded, his face calm. Inside, his heart was racing. Not from fear, but from release. Across the room, Clint Eastwood remained standing near the stage. The microphone still in front of him. The echo of Dean's words hanging in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Character earns respect. That line struck harder than Clint expected. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself it was just a room full of people pretending to be deep. But something about the way Dean had spoken without anger, without defense, had disrupted the certainty Clint had carried in with him. Clint hated uncertainty. He believed respect came from discipline, from work, from seriousness, from never letting anyone see you bend. And yet, the room had bent toward Dean. Not because Dean demanded it, but because he didn't. As the host awkwardly reclaimed the microphone and steered the evening back on track, conversations resumed, but they were different now. Quieter, more cautious. People whispered, "Did you feel that?" He didn't insult him at all. That took restraint. "I didn't expect that from Dean." Clint returned to his seat. A few people nodded politely at him. None spoke. That silence bothered him more than booze ever could. Meanwhile, Dean was being approached, slowly, respectfully. Not fans, peers. One producer leaned in and said quietly, "That took courage." Dean smiled politely. "It just took honesty." Another guest added, "You could have destroyed him." Dean shook his head. "That's easy. It's also forgettable." But beneath the calm exterior, Dean felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Because speaking with dignity is powerful, but it also leaves you exposed. Later that evening, Dean stepped outside onto the balcony to get some air. The city lights shimmered below like scattered stars. He rested his hands on the railing, breathing in the cool night. For a brief moment, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. Not because he regretted his words, but because dignity doesn't always protect you from consequences. Behind him, the balcony door opened. Dean didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He recognized the footsteps, measured, controlled, heavy with intention. Clint Eastwood stopped a few feet away. The air shifted. Neither man spoke. Seconds passed, and Clint broke the silence. "You planned that," he said flatly. Dean exhaled slowly. "No." Clint stepped closer. "You knew exactly what to say." Dean turned now, meeting Clint's eyes. I knew what not to say. Clint studied him really, studied him for the first time that night. Not as a performer, not as a personality, as a man. "You embarrassed me," Clint said. Dean didn't deny it. "I didn't intend to," he replied. "But I wasn't going to disappear either." Clint clenched his jaw. "You let them turn against me." Dean shook his head gently. "No, I let them decide for themselves." That answer landed harder than any insult. Clint looked away toward the city, his reflection faintly visible in the glass doors behind them. "You know what I see when I look at you?" Clint said after a moment. Dean waited. "I see someone who never had to be alone," Clint continued. "Someone people like, us. Someone who's always invited." Dean listened. "Us. I had to fight for everything," Clint said. "Respect wasn't given to me. I took it." Dean nodded. "I believe you." Clint turned sharply. "Then why do you make it look so easy?" Dean's voice softened. "Because you're looking at the result," he said, "not the cost." That stopped Clint cold. Dean leaned back against the railing. "They laughed at me when I started," Dean continued. "Told me I was nothing special, that I should be grateful for scraps." He smiled faintly. "Sound familiar?" Clint said nothing. "I learned something early on," Dean said. "You can survive by hardening yourself or by staying human." He met Clint's eyes again. "Both paths are painful, but only one lets you sleep at night." The city hummed below them. Traffic, music, life going on, indifferent to ego and reputation. For the first time in years, Clint Eastwood felt something crack loudly, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. "You think I'm all ego?" Clint said quietly. Dean considered his words carefully. "No," he said. "I think you're afraid that if you soften, people will stop respecting you." Clint swallowed. No one had ever said that to him, because no one had ever dared. Inside the ballroom, laughter erupted, forced, delayed, unaware of the quiet reckoning unfolding just outside. Clint straightened. "You don't know me," he said. Dean nodded. "That's true," then he added, gently. "But tonight, I saw someone who confuses strength with distance." That was the moment. Not when Clint's voice rose, not when his fists clenched, but when his shoulders dropped just slightly, almost imperceptibly. "I didn't mean to call you out like that," Clint said at last. It wasn't an apology, but it was closer than Clint had ever come. Dean didn't push. "I know," he said. They stood there, two very different men, united by something neither had expected. Respect earned the hard way. Inside, the music swelled again. The night moved on. But something irreversible had happened, because Clint Eastwood, the man who prided himself on never kneeling to anyone, is beginning to realize that strength without humility eventually collapses under its own weight. And the reckoning was still coming. Not in front of cameras, not on a stage, but in a moment so quiet, so personal, it would bring him closer to his knees than any public humiliation ever could. The next morning, Hollywood woke up pretending nothing had happened. Newspapers talked about box office numbers. Studio offices buzzed with meetings. Assistants rushed down hallways, clutching scripts and coffee cups. On the surface, the industry moved on the way it always did, fast, loud, forgetful. But beneath that noise, a quiet current had begun to move. And Clint Eastwood felt it the moment he walked onto his next set. Normally, people stiffened when he arrived. Conversation stopped. Eyes sharpened. Respect followed him like a shadow. This time, something was different. People still nodded, still smiled. But now, there was hesitation, a pause. As if they were seeing him through a slightly altered lens. Clint hated that. He delivered his lines flawlessly, as always. His posture was perfect, his tone sharp. No one could accuse him of slipping, and yet, between takes, he caught whispers. Not cruel, not mocking. Thoughtful, He didn't expect that response. Dean handled that with class. Makes you think, doesn't it? Think. That word echoed in Clint's head long after the cameras stopped rolling. That night, Clint sat alone in his house. Lights dimmed, a half-finished drink untouched beside him. He stared at the wall, replaying the balcony conversation over and over, not Dean's words, but his own reactions. You embarrassed me. You let them turn against me. He realized something unsettling. Those weren't the words of a confident man. They were the words of a threatened one. Clint had spent his life believing control was strength. Distance was protection. Silence was power. But Dean Martin hadn't used any of those tools. And yet, he had dominated the moment. Not by overpowering Clint. By exposing him, the thought made Clint's chest tighten. Meanwhile, across town, Dean Martin faced his own reckoning. Publicly, he was praised. Quietly, he was warned. A longtime associate pulled him aside and said, "You made someone powerful uncomfortable." Another told him, "People admire you." But admiration makes enemies. Dean listened. He always did. That night, he sat at his piano, fingers resting on the keys without playing a note. His home was quiet, but his mind wasn't. He hadn't intended to change anything. He had only intended to be honest. Yet honesty, he knew, often carries consequences no one prepares you for. A phone call broke the silence. Dean picked it up. It was an invitation. Private, unexpected. A studio executive one known for choosing. Sides carefully asked Dean to meet the next evening. No explanation, just a time and a place. Dean agreed. When he hung up, he stared at the phone for a long moment, sensed what was coming, because moments like the one at the gala don't fade. They reveal. The following evening, Dean arrived at a quiet, understated restaurant. No press, no crowds, just low light and polished wood. Clint Eastwood was already there, not at the center table, not commanding attention, but sitting alone in a corner booth. Dean paused. This wasn't pride. This was intention. Dean approached calmly. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Clint looked up. "Wouldn't be here if I did," he replied. Dean sat. For a few moments, neither man spoke. Then Clint surprised him. "I rewatched some of your work," Clint said. Dean raised an eyebrow slightly. "Not for the performance," Clint added quickly. "For the way people respond to you." Dean waited. "They trust you," Clint said. "Even when you're doing very little." Dean smiled faintly. "That's not accidental." Clint leaned forward. "Then tell me something. What? How do you stay open, without letting people walk over you?" The question hung between them. Dean took his time answering. "You don't avoid pain," he said. "You choose which pain is worth carrying." Clint absorbed that. "I've been carrying the wrong kind," he admitted quietly. That was the closest thing to a confession Clint Eastwood had ever offered anyone. Dean didn't gloat, didn't smile. He simply nodded. "I used to think being liked made me weak," Clint continued. "So I made sure no one got close enough to decide." Dean met his gaze. And did it work? Clint hesitated. "No," he said. "D just made me lonely." That word landed hard. Lonely. Clint had never allowed himself to say it out loud. Dean didn't interrupt. "Last night," Clint went on, "you didn't fight me. You didn't try to win." Dean nodded. "Because winning would have meant losing myself." Clint let out a slow breath. For the first time, he said, "I wondered if strength might look different than I thought." The waiter approached, quietly placing 2 cups of coffee between them. No one touched theirs. Clint stared into the cup like it might answer something for him. "I built my career on never backing down," he said. "But last night, I felt like I was standing in front of a mirror I didn't choose." Dean's voice was gentle. "Those are usually the mirrors that matter most." Clint looked up. "And what happens when a man doesn't like what he sees?" Dean didn't answer immediately. Then he has two choices, he said, finally. He can shatter the mirror or change. The silence that followed was heavy, not tense. Honest. Outside, a car passed, headlights briefly cutting across the window. For a second, Clint's reflection appeared beside Dean's two men. Different paths, same moment. "You think I owe you an apology," Clint said. Dean shook his head. "No," Clint frowned. "No, you don't owe me anything," Dean said. "You owe yourself the truth." That was it. That was the blow Clint hadn't seen coming. Not accusation, not demand. Freedom. Clint leaned back, eyes closed briefly, as if carrying something heavy he was finally allowed to set down. "I don't know how to change," he admitted. Dean smiled, not triumphantly, but kindly. "Neither did I," he said. "I just knew I couldn't keep pretending." When Clint opened his eyes again, something in them had shifted. The edge was still there, but beneath it humility. And humility, once found, has a way of pulling a man lower than pride ever could. Closer to his knees, closer to truth. But the real test was still coming. Because words in private are easy. What matters is what a man does when the world is watching. And soon, Clint Eastwood would have to choose to protect the image he built, or to honor the lesson that had quietly undone him. The industry gathered again 3 weeks later. Different venue, bigger audience, cameras everywhere. An awards ceremony televised, polished, rehearsed down to the second. This was the kind of night where legacies were reinforced, not questioned. Where every word spoken on stage would be replayed, analyzed, remembered. Dean Martin hadn't planned on attending. He was tired not physically, but emotionally. The quiet after the storm had been heavier than the storm itself. People treated him differently now, with more reverence, more care. And reverence, he had learned, could be just as isolating as disrespect. But when the invitation arrived, something told him this night wasn't about trophies. It was about closure. Backstage, Clint Eastwood stood alone in front of a mirror, not fixing his tie, not rehearsing remarks, just looking. The man staring back at him was familiar, strong jaw, steady eyes, but something in that reflection felt unfinished. For the first time in his career, Clint hadn't prepared a speech. He hadn't planned a narrative, because planning had always been his armor. And armor, he was beginning to understand, can become a prison. The announcer's voice echoed through the hall. And now, a special presentation from one of the most influential figures in modern cinema. Clint stepped into the light. Applause thundered. The kind he had earned 100 times before. But this time, he didn't absorb it. He waited. The room quieted. He looked out over the crowd, faces expectant, confident they knew who he was and what he would say. Clint gripped the podium lightly. "I've spent most of my life believing strength meant never yielding," he began. Standard opening. Comfortable. But then his voice shifted, never admitting doubt. Never showing softness. A few people glanced at each other. Clint continued. "I believed respect was something you took by force of will." Dean Martin, seated several rows back, felt his chest tighten. This wasn't rehearsed. This was real. Clint took a breath. "A few weeks ago," he said, "I learned how wrong I was." A ripple moved through the audience. Clint turned slightly, scanning the crowd. "There are moments that expose you," he said. "Not publicly, but internally. Moments where you realize the story you've been telling yourself no longer holds." His hands tightened briefly on the podium. "I had one of those moments. Silence. No music, no cue cards. Just truth." Clint's eyes found Dean, and he did something no one expected. He stepped away from the podium and walked toward him. The room held its breath. Clint stopped in front of Dean's row, and then slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just enough. Enough to make the gesture unmistakable. A man known for never bowing, humbled himself. "I owe this man my gratitude," Clint said, his voice steady but low. Not for flattering me, not for sparing me. He met Dean's eyes, but for respecting me enough to tell the truth without cruelty. The room was frozen. Dean stood instinctively, reaching out. "Clint," he began, but Clint raised a hand gently. "Let me finish." He turned back to the audience. "We celebrate talent here," Clint said. "But tonight, I want to honor character." His voice grew stronger, because talent impresses, but character transforms. Then he looked at Dean again. "You reminded me that strength isn't standing above others," Clint said. "It's standing with them." Dean's eyes burned. He hadn't wanted this, but he understood it. Clint straightened and extended his hand. Dean took it. The applause that followed wasn't loud at first. It built, wave after wave, not for the gesture, but for the meaning behind it. Backstage later, away from cameras and clapping hands, Clint and Dean stood quietly. "I was terrified," Clint admitted with a faint smile. Dean chuckled softly. "So was I," Clint nodded. "I thought humility would make me smaller." Dean placed a hand on his shoulder. "It didn't," he said. "It made you human." Clint exhaled, as if releasing years of weight. "You didn't win that night," Clint said. "At the gala?" Dean shook his head. "Neither did you." They shared a look. "We both did," Clint finished. Outside, reporters buzzed, headlines already forming. But the real story wouldn't be written in print. It would be felt. By every person who believed strength meant dominance. By every person who thought kindness was weakness. By every person who needed to know that dignity doesn't shout. It stands, and sometimes it kneels. Not in defeat, but in truth.